We're in Gayle village, standing by the ford of Gayle Beck, which leads down to Gayle Mill, and it's the starting point for many of our waterfall walks in Wensleydale. We're looking down towards Gayle Mill, started in 1784 by the Routh brothers, and it is the oldest structurally unaltered cotton mill in existence. Gayle Mill started out by spinning cotton, but by 1806 the mill was rented out for the spinning of flax, and later that spinning turned to using wool as the raw material for the local domestic hosiery market. Until 1840 a carpet manufacturer spun wool for his carpet mill in Wensleydale, and by 1867 the mill was converted into a sawmill. During World War II, Gayle Mill was the billet of some Scottish regiments. Their main purpose was to test amphibious military vehicles using the mill pond in preparation for the D-Day landings in France. The sawmill kept running until 1988, when it was no longer financially viable. The owner, Brian Alderson, realised the historical treasure he possessed needed to be shared with future generations. His vision was finally realised when, under new ownership by the charity Cultural Trust, it reopened as a working heritage attraction in 2008. Gayle Mill is a good example of how the power of the becks and waterfalls in the Dales has been used for industry down through the centuries. We are starting our walk to Aysgill Force. We've come up from Gayle, down in the valley below, and we're standing by one of the many dry stone walls around these fields. But we're noticing these big slabs here, two levels of them. Oh, golly. And the gate's really stiff. But we've been through worse. Ooh! We've arrived at Aysgill Force. There's not much of a force today because the weather has been dry for such a long time, but even so, it's jolly impressive. This is the beck that flows along and falls down 40 feet down Aysgill Force to the pool below. We are setting off on our waterfall walk this morning from Gayle to Hardraw in Wensleydale on a beautiful sunny morning, walking through buttercup fields with cows gently resting and not a breath of air. Our walk takes us past the Yorkshire Dales National Park Visitor Centre in Hawes, which is housed in the old railway buildings and has a museum attached. It has a very good exhibition about the way of life in the Dales. The museum was started by two ladies at the beginning of the 20th century who had the foresight to realise that times were changing rapidly and that if things weren't kept, they would be lost forever. And so they started this museum. We are in the Victorian pleasure grounds of Hardraw Force. Behind me is the bandstand, built for the entertainment of the Victorians, and in 1880 the Hardraw Scar Brass Band concert took place, and it is the second oldest outdoor contest. This is all that remains of the former tea bothy and shelter for the gentry, who after their bracing walk around the waterfalls would need refreshments. They would be guests of Lord Wharncliffe, who was the owner of the estate then, and they'd stay with him in his hunting lodge at Simonston Hall. Beyond me are the steps made famous in the Robin Hood film starring Kevin Costner, when Maid Marian caught her first sight of Robin Hood and he was bathing in the Buff. So here is Hardraw Force Waterfall, England's highest single drop waterfall, and it falls 100 feet through the Yorkshire series of rocks. But we're seeing it after a very dry period, so it would be really good to see it after a lot of heavy rain, because even now it's pretty spectacular. Some years ago, after very heavy rain, the stones at the lip of the waterfall were dislodged, which meant that it wasn't a single drop waterfall anymore. But Lord Hardraw was determined to keep that position of owning the most single drop waterfall, and so the stones were repaired very skillfully so that you cannot tell that they are not the original stones up there, and it continues to just squeeze through that small gap, which makes it so impressive. We have left the waterfall and are coming up through the fields on a parallel path up to Simonston Hotel, which was Lord Wharncliffe's hunting lodge. It is a magnificent view, looking across to Hawes and then down to Hardraw village. We have come to the hunting lodge of Lord Wharncliffe, now a country hotel. We have walked over the fields from Simonston to this little hamlet of Sedbusk, where we're enjoying a rest on the green, surrounded by the bunting still up from the Jubilee celebrations. And then it's downhill all the way to Haylands Bridge, Hawes and then Gayle. Going through these fields has been quite an experience, because there's been what they call stiles of very narrow gaps in the wall, and then there's a gate with an extremely strong spring, so trying to traverse those has not been easy. But also each field has its own distinctive barn, which have been wonderful to look at, and we can see two behind me now. These barns, or cow usses, are a distinctive feature of the Yorkshire Dales. Many fields have one of these stone-built barns, mainly built in the 19th century, which were used to house cattle in winter on the ground floor and to store hay on the first floor. We're starting our waterfall walks today in Askrigg. The name Askrigg comes from the Norse and means a high ridge with ash trees on it. In the 1700s it had its heyday when the textile industries and clockmaking, and it was the main market town of Wensleydale, though now it is Hawes. I'm sitting on the market cross, but it had a rather cruel history because there is a ring on the cobblestones where the bull would be tied and to be baited by dogs. Askrig's main claim to fame now is it is where the first series of All Creatures Great and Small was filmed. This house was used as Skeldale House, where Siegfried Farnan had his veterinary practice and where James Herriot came to start his. Outside the house is an old car, but in a lot better condition than the one that you see James Herriot driving on the television series. We've left the hustle and bustle of Askrigg behind and have come along a footpath through one of the many hay meadows in the Dales, where we are requested to walk in single file because they'll be cutting them for winter feed. In fact, they're already cutting some of them. We saw a tractor with enormous bales of hay negotiating the narrow streets of Askrigg just now. It is very warm today with little wind, so it's lovely to leave that beautiful hay meadow and to come and sit in the shade by the beck and the lovely old barn. The rock formations are interesting here, great slabs of the rock, and here the beck is quite still and looks rather deep, and I can keep seeing little circles in the water as if there's fish there, and the sun is catching the peaty brown colour of it. We have been climbing steadily up, watching the tree roots all over the path, and the stream is way down there now, and the breeze coming across the fields is wonderful. Everywhere we look, we see the dry stone walls and a barn in the corner of a field. We have come to Aysgill Force, so it's very damp and dank down here, and lots of flies and not a lot of water. After the diversion down to Aysgill Force, we're back up on the main footpath now, going to Whitfield Gill. We have arrived at the lower Whitfield Force before the path takes us back to Askrigg, and again there's not much force behind this water at the moment. We've left the valley of Aysgill Force, climbed up through the beech trees, and now we're going down Low Straits Lane down to Askrigg. We are starting our walk to Aysgarth Falls, which was once part of a tropical sea. We are at the upper falls now. Obviously there's not much water going over the limestone rocks because it's been so dry, so we have to imagine what it would be like in a really gushing time. We've just crossed the bridge and have got this wonderful view looking up to the falls, where, as I said, we have to use our imagination, thinking that they would all be covered by water after heavy rainfall, and what a sight that would be, and a sound. After having had a welcome cup of coffee, we are now going to see the lower and middle falls, walking through Freeholders Wood. And the freeholders were the villagers of Carperby, and they were allowed to collect the fallen wood for centuries. This wood is described as ancient woodland because it has had tree cover since at least 1600. This is coppiced woodland, where as well as tall canopy trees, we can see hazel that has been coppiced. Now the hazel can be identified by its broad light green leaves, nuts in the summer, and in late winter yellow catkins. And coppiced trees can be recognised as tree stumps with many new shoots growing from them. So we're walking through woodland which has been here since at least 1600. This is Middle Falls, where we can see in the stepped rocks forming the waterfalls near horizontal layers of limestone separated by thin bands of soft shale. And these rocks, geologically part of the Yorkshire series, were laid down on a seafloor over 300 million years ago. So why is the water sometimes brown and frothy? Although the Ure is very pure and unpolluted, the water is often a brownish colour and foam builds up near the falls. But both of these phenomena are entirely natural. The Ure is fed by gills and becks draining from high moorland, and the brown colour is simply due to peat staining. The foaming arises from the natural breakdown of plant material on the moors. This produces a range of natural chemicals, one of which closely resembles the substance that makes up ordinary soap. In the soft waters of the Ure, lathering takes place, especially where the water is agitated at a waterfall. This area is known as Ridding's Field because back in the medieval times it was rid of trees, and the people used the land to grow crops like oats and barley. But it's been left to grow back now by the national park because it's not big enough for grazing, and so they're managing it now. These are the lower falls, the tallest of the Aysgarth waterfalls. The limestone is made up of millions of shells and skeletons of sea creatures. And at the time it was formed, Aysgarth was enjoying a Caribbean-type climate, and a shallow tropical sea covered this area. But later earth movements have raised the rock to form dry land, and the alternating layers of hard limestone and soft shale have produced the waterfalls. We're now going to return back to the visitor centre, where it'll probably be time for lunch.